Hello, I'm Julia Kowalski, and I'm an assistant professor of global affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm delighted to welcome you to our series, Mediating Justice, which I've co-organized with Katherine Martineau, assistant professor of Asian studies at Binghamton University. And Katherine is also one of our dialogue partners today. This series has been generously hosted by the Kroc Institute of Peace Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Before I describe our series and introduce today's guests, and in the spirit of justice and seeing its absence, I would like to recognize that our conversation about justice today is organized on the lands of Native peoples. The University of Notre Dame resides on the traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee, the Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. We have created this series to bring together anthropologists and peace studies scholars in order to discuss how ideas of justice thrive in particular contexts. We are inspired by recent events that have demonstrated once again how complex and urgent justice is as a concept and as a goal. These include the systemic inequities exposed by COVID morbidity and mortality, and social mobilization against racist police violence and structural racism in the United States. To engage these questions, however, we turn not to philosophy or jurisprudence, but to the institutions and interactions that enact ideas of justice. We are asking questions like, how do everyday practices reflect, reproduce, or change prevailing approaches to justice? Rather than seeking a universal definition, we hope to explore how concepts of justice are mediated by the interactions, institutions, and conditions of their use. This series thus seeks to expand our understanding of how justice works, including how it might work as a normative goal for justice-seeking scholarship across disciplines and across fields. So I'm delighted today to be here with two scholars, Professor Martineau and Professor Nathan. I will briefly introduce the two of them before diving into our dialogue. So Professor Katherine Martineau is a cultural and linguistic anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University. Her first book draws on ethnographic research among vernacular and English-speaking journalists in Bhubaneswar, India, in order to explore the contradictory impacts of developmentalism on freedom of speech. Her new research project focuses on the global circulation of communicative healing methods like restorative circles. For this project, she is also training in various restorative and mediational practices. And this is one reason why we have paired Professor Martineau with Dr. Laurie Nathan, who is a professor of the practice of mediation at the Keough School of Global Affairs and the director of the mediation program at the Kroc Institute. He is the author of 4 books, including Community of Insecurity, SADC's Struggle for Peace and Security in Southern Africa, and No Ownership, No Commitment, a guide to local ownership of security sector reform. In addition to this scholarship, he is a senior mediation advisor to the United Nations. He has participated in high-level peacemaking efforts in Africa and helped design the mediation units of the African Union and African sub-regional bodies. So the conversation that we'll have today is open-ended by design, and I'm going to begin by posing some opening questions and inviting each guest to reflect on their individual perspective. And these are questions that we ask in all of these sessions. So what is the role of justice in your work? How does justice operate as a focus of study and as a concept for the communities and the individual actors that you work with? How do questions of justice shape your methods and your research practice? And so I'm going to start by asking Professor Martineau to reflect.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for hosting today, and Laurie for being here. I'm so delighted to talk to you, Laurie, and would really like to train with you. So this is a delight for me to be able to talk with you. You know, I helped write these questions, so I have this relationship with them, which is mostly one of questioning. I don't know the answers to them yet, but I'll narrate a little bit about how I came to asking these questions, since they are in some ways my questions. The first is really personal. I'm white and I grew up in the center of Michigan. So the, anti-Black racism in Michigan is very implicit, but I grew up about a mile from the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Reservation. And so the anti-Indian racism was really explicit. And before I could even think, as I was thinking about how to go to kindergarten, I was already participating in this really explicitly colonial situation. And my own family came as settlers to the United States. So I come to these spaces and to these questions very aware that I'm here because of the injustices that I want to be a part of dismantling, and that's the privilege that my being here is based upon. I then in my doctoral work studied British colonialism in order to get a better sense. I think I was working through a lot of what I had lived with as a younger person, and my doctoral work was looking at the kind of long-term impacts of colonialism and the injustices of colonialism. I was working with the journalists. I studied a lot of how journalists do their work in an area of the country that's very marginal, very poor, and where there are a lot of Adivasi or indigenous tribes. And so these journalists were often, kind of caught in these post-colonial contradictions and trying to understand how to come up with an ethical path forward when nothing seems like a good solution. No way of writing about it seemed right, the problems that they were facing. And so this is the first book, this is me trying to sort through this. And as I was, sort of coming out of that research, I was really feeling like there was just colonialism, like colonialism was the answer to everything. Everything was about colonialism. And I wanted to think with what could be next, like what else is there other than just constantly being caught in colonialism. And so I began to take a lot of, I was really inspired by a lot of the recent work in abolition studies and on decolonization here in the United States. And wanted to bring that into dialogue with some of the anti-colonial movements that have been, over the last century working in India. And so I've been looking for a space where I can bring these kinds of really diverse movements toward justice into a dialogue. And interestingly, there's a lot of global circulations, especially of Gandhianism. And so I started to look at, well, where is it that Gandhianism is circulating? Where is it that these ideas of alternative pathways toward justice or equity start to come together? And so I kind of found my way toward restorative justice practices, and began to kind of reviewing many of the different ways that people were trying to invent alternatives to, say, punitive responses to harm, or new modes of dealing with conflict in communities. What I was finding was that many of these methods involve getting people together in a room and then talking. And so I started to think of, like, what's happening in those rooms, right? What is it, and what's happening outside of those rooms to support whatever can actually happen in that room, and what kind of healing is possible through this. And so I began to think, so I developed this project. So I'm working on this project, and unfortunately I started it and then the pandemic hit. And so it's, I was supposed to be in India this summer working on it. It's been much slower. A lot of things have moved online, but I'm also, doing school at home with my kids and things like that. So it's been slowed down tremendously. But, as part of it, I'm training in restorative practices in many different ways of doing restorative circles. I've been training with a group that, people that do nonviolent communication, which is a kind of branded system that has now spread around the globe. So it has this kind of institutional structure to it. And many of the communities that are using these tools are very utopian, though they're also being deployed in Sri Lanka and Nepal conflicts as well. And then they're circulating back to the United States. They kind of circle through India and then circle back. So there's a group, a Gandhian center in Rochester, New York, that's using Gandhian principles of nonviolence and forms of this kind of communicative healing, which is what I'm calling it. And then trying to bring it into situations of kind of race-based conflict and poverty, kind of entrenched racial poverty in Rochester. So I'm really interested in tracing the connections across all these spaces. And I think in all of that, when it comes to justice, I don't know what it is. One of the questions that I have is, how is it, one of the things I've found is that people don't come in with a particular idea of justice, and yet they're working towards something together in those spaces. And so I'm interested in how there can be a kind of horizon in a way, and this is a bit of how Eve talks about it, but a horizon that maybe people don't agree on, or that they don't see eye to eye on. And so how is it that the interactions in that space support or create some shared ground? So I think I'll stop there, and Laurie, invite you.
Great. Thank you to Julia and thank you to Kate for convening this discussion and this series and for inviting me to participate. I grew up in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, mid-1980s, is the height of the struggle against apartheid. I was deeply involved in anti-apartheid activism as a student, and I had no interest at that time whatsoever in mediation. I thought mediation was a bit of a sellout, because who wants to settle for a draw? Our commitment was justice and equality and freedom, liberation. And our aim was the overthrow of the state. It turns out that we had a negotiated settlement that neither side won. And negotiated settlements entail compromise. After the transition to a democracy, I became director of a Center for Conflict Resolution and became deeply involved in mediation and negotiations. And I developed an entirely different perspective on peace and justice and the relationship between them. Mediators are primarily concerned with peace, the absence of naked, physical, large-scale violence, at the least. At the least, they want negative peace, to use Galtung's term. They want an end to outright physical violence. At best, we want peace with justice, positive peace, to use Galtung's term. But it's not always attainable. And mediation is an arena in which you have a broiling crucible of contestation around justice. The parties disagree on who has suffered the most in terms of injustice. All the sides have a deep, visceral sense of being the victim of a gross manifest injustice by their enemy. So they disagree on that. They disagree on questions of impunity and accountability for war crimes and other mass atrocity crimes. So whether leaders go punished or unpunished, whether they're able to remain in office or not, is a huge arena or topic of contestation. They disagree on other aspects of transitional justice, such as reparations for harm done communities writ large. They disagree on what constitutes a just society going forward. So is a just society one that is egalitarian, one that has a socialist orientation and seeks to create a greater measure of equality? Or is a just society one that is more that of a kind of Western liberal capitalist system? They disagree on the system of justice in the future. So they may disagree on the nature and extent of judicial reform, because to interfere with the judiciary means to compromise its independence. But what if it's not an independent judiciary under the current regime? They may disagree on all of these issues on political grounds, but also on cultural grounds. In other words, the parties may have different cultural understandings of what is justice, what is injustice, how does one deal with this, what is reconciliation. And then all of this is further complicated by the fact that in a mediated settlement, there is no outright winner. We have settled for a draw, which means that all the parties have to compromise, and have to compromise on justice. And that is very difficult. That is very painful. And we get stuck. The parties can get stuck for long periods, and they can fail. Mediation fails more often than it succeeds in high intensity conflict. And you only have the prospect of a sustainable settlement if all the parties believe that the settlement is sufficiently just, not perfectly just. That is not attainable. If that's what you want, you've got to win. But if you're settling for a draw, you're looking to compromise on justice, and you're looking for a sufficient sense of justice. And then all of this is further complicated by the mediator's positionality. And I'll end with comments on that. We are meant to be, as mediators, impartial. That is a fundamental mediation norm. If the parties perceive us as biased against one of them or in favor of another, the disfavored party will reject us. It's as pragmatic and brutal as that. So the parties have leverage over us. They can walk away from the table whenever they want to, and we can't get them back. So we are meant to be impartial in the sense that we're not taking sides, but we're not neutral. We have mandates. If I am a mediator on behalf of the United Nations or the African Union, I have a mandate from our organization, which is pretty clear on respect for human rights, respect for international law, respect for the rule of law, clarity on transitional justice. And that's my mandate that I am bound by. And I would be fired by the organization that appointed me as the mediator if I defied their values and norms. And then lastly, I have my own position. Of course, I'm not coming into a situation of, violence and massive criminality and injustice without a view on the matter. I have to maintain a dispassionate posture, but I'm doing all of this mediation because it matters greatly. And I have to be careful that my sense of justice and injustice does not cloud my judgment to the extent that I make mistakes and am perceived by any of the parties as being biased against them because they won't trust me. And if they don't trust me, I can't be effective.
Thank you, both of you. So I have a follow-up question, and then I'll kind of yield the floor to both of you, and I suspect that things will go from there. So listening to you both talk, I'm struck by the fact that we have kind of two approaches to justice that center interaction, right? So whether that's in terms of talk, communication, contestation, even compromise, we're hearing a lot about the role of interaction in delimiting and being a space in which people work towards a concept of justice. And at the same time, I'm also hearing similarities in this idea that the expert, whether that's a mediator or an anthropologist, is meant to be at once maybe impartial, like Laurie said, but with a mandate, whether that's to an employer or to an academic discipline that wants a certain modality of knowledge at the end of the thing. And also with a position and a form of positionality. And, Katherine put so beautifully the positionality of being an American anthropologist at this particular historical moment. So given all of those things, my question is to both of you, how do you conceptualize and analyze the role of interaction in facilitating or preventing this process of discovery around what justice is or could be?
It's taking me some time to think through. Yeah, I have so many questions for Laurie that are really like in the weeds. Like I really want to get into these situations you were talking about. And I think that you're asking, how are we conceptualizing the process of even understanding what justice might be, right? Given these kinds of interactional situations. And I think that that's the question, in some way, that's the question that brought me to this project, right? Is it gives me a chance to interact with people like Laurie, who I think understand that everybody is in some way. I feel like a lot of people in the spaces where they're coming because they feel like there's some kind of injustice that has happened, right? And they themselves have usually both at least one explicit idea of justice, a story, a narrative, And maybe they have a philosophy to go with that. And they also have a kind of implicit working set of practices that may have a completely different understanding of how things should go. And so I think for me at this point, I'm really approaching it as an ethnographer, where I'm just trying to understand what those things are and how they work, right? How can I even kind of understand and recognize that those are features of any interaction that are going on? And I think that people, my sense is that people in these fields as facilitators, people who work as facilitators, have like an amazing wisdom about this. That these are the people who like know in their bones when to see and how to use and how to bring out these qualities that people bring into the interactions. And not that they can't be changed, they can also be transformed. And so I think, you know, that's part of my interest for myself, is asking this question, which is like, how can we see justice as something that is really always multiple, right? And maybe always up for some negotiation. And learn from the people who know the most about it.
Yeah, I mean, the question of interaction and mediation is absolutely critical. This is the job of the mediator. She is facilitating communication, dialogue, problem solving, conflict resolution amongst people. That's the essence of the job, is to design and facilitate interaction between them to the point at which they reach agreements that they find acceptable. If they don't find the agreements acceptable, there's no agreement that's sustainable. So this is a pragmatic, not an ethical consideration, of course. No sustainable agreement, no agreement. Now, so our job is to shift the relationship between the parties from one of enmity, and in armed conflict it's one of mortal enmity, they're trying to kill each other, to one of political reconciliation, meaning they don't have to love each other, they don't have to be best friends, but they have to be willing to cooperate and compete for power non-violently. And that is immensely difficult, even in an interpersonal dispute that's one is mediating in the absence of violence. So when there's violence, it's even more difficult to effect that shift from enmity to reconciliation. I don't mean reconciliation in a romantic way. So I'm making a point of that because I think we tend to romanticize reconciliation. This is brutal. I mean, I participated in South Africa's negotiations to end apartheid. I was doing this in the realm of the military. I represented the ANC at negotiations, amongst others. Sitting across the table were apartheid soldiers. We hated each other. We hated each other so much it was difficult to have a conversation. We couldn't have coffee together during the breaks. And our mandate from our respective bosses was get a deal. Do a deal with your enemy. And if you can't stomach this, go away and we will replace you with another negotiator. Now, so it's very difficult for the parties emotionally and psychologically. As a mediator, I want to say to the parties, the content of the deal, the content of the agreement on justice and dealing with injustice is not up to me, it's up to you. My job is to help you reach an agreement that you guys can live with. But there's a tension there, which I tried to capture earlier with my comments on positionality, because I don't want to support an unfair deal. And I'm worried about the inequality in bargaining power at the negotiating table. And my instinct is to help the weaker party. And I have often helped the weaker party. But I help the weaker party at the point at which I have enough trust with the stronger party to seek its permission to help the weaker party. And I can explain how I would help the weaker party. But in situations where the weaker party is struggling to negotiate, it may be strong in the field, may be strong militarily, but it's weak at the table, doesn't have the confidence to negotiate. And there's a concern they may end up negotiating a bad deal for themselves. I may say to the stronger party, this is not in your interest. It's not in your interest to win so much that your opponent leaves here feeling humiliated. You don't have a sustainable deal. They need to win a lot, and you need to win a lot. I need to help the weaker party. Do I have your permission to do that? I've never had a strong party say no. I've offered training to weak parties. I've offered educational support to weak parties. In all cases, I say to the strong party, whatever I offer the weak party, I offer you too. And I'm pretending that this is all in the interest of a pragmatic outcome, but it's also very much because I care about injustice. And I want to do what I can, even though I'm meant to be impartial, to alleviate injustice.
I love hearing you describe that and the way that you are able to build enough trust so that you can then go and say, really, with full transparency, I'm concerned about this power imbalance, right? And I, that you can say with full transparency, I want to help the other side so that I can ultimately help you, right? And that's, I'm working on such smaller scales. So part of the comparison between our work is scalar. And, I'm looking at people who are in a room together. So I watched this one negotiation between a person who, it was a kind of restorative practice between a person who felt, the person who raised it felt that she had been sexually harassed by the other person in the room. And I don't want to say too much about it, but because of confidentiality, but race was an issue in the accusation itself. And race was clearly an issue in the experience of the accused. And nobody mentioned race the entire time. And they came out with an apparently fine solution that everybody was okay with. And I was just going out of my mind because it was clear to me there was this major issue that had not been raised, and I felt like this was a clear power imbalance. And that, in fact, the person who had been accused felt that he couldn't even raise it because it was such a power imbalance. Like, race was so normalized in the situation. And so I guess I wonder, do you have similar kinds of situations like this where there's a kind of norm? I mean, maybe not in such conflict, maybe everything is up for debate. What would you say, like, are there these kinds of norms that govern?
I see that, I would treat that as a matter of technique. I want to work with the parties separately for quite a long time before bringing them together. And that's true for interpersonal disputes or community disputes or the big kind of civil war thing. Because when you bring them in the room together, there's too much emotion, there's too much heat, there's too much hatred, there's too much fear, whatever it is, the emotions. And I don't think you're going to get a constructive conversation going. So I will work with the parties separately. And, the technical term here is shuttle diplomacy, so that's the technical term in terms of international mediation. We're shuttling between the parties. And our job is as an intermediary, as a broker of communication and dialogue. And our job is to communicate then to each party what the other party is saying, but we're also doing it with some skill, hopefully, and some finesse. I would tend to downplay the viciousness of the tone when I communicate to the other. I would seek to amplify any perceived common ground, but I can't lie to the party because they know the situation better than I do. But I'm trying to increase their confidence in me as the third party and increase their confidence in the process of mediated dialogue and ultimately increase their confidence in each other. Now, to come back to your example, Kate, if you're talking to the parties separately, they may well be more confident to express to you the deep anxieties they have. And you would then say, can I communicate that to the other party? Now, the response may be, no, I'd rather you keep that confidential. That often happens. And my response as the mediator is, you need me to facilitate communication. So you can't keep saying to me, keep this confidential. I'll respect confidentiality if you insist, but I can't do my job if I'm keeping everything confidential. And then when you talk to the other, the more powerful party, it's possible to diplomatically, kindly point out that there is race and gender and power and literacy and whatever else is on the table in relation to identity and inequality. And to help understanding. If the two of you are in conflict, you can hear each other more carefully, more clearly when you're not in the room, and I serve as the intermediary between you. Now, just one last comment. My identity is also relevant here. So when I mediated in Cape Town, extensively in community conflicts, we would choose the identity of the mediation team very carefully. We were approached on one occasion by the Gender Commission, it's a statutory body, having a big fight, not exclusively female, but overwhelmingly female. We would not have considered sending a man in as the mediator. It would have been a stupid decision. We would often make sure that our mediation team reflected the composition of the parties in terms of race, which was so salient in South Africa, gender, and class, which we neglect sometimes, because working class folk are less confident sometimes in negotiations. They think they're going to be outmaneuvered by a more articulate or technically smart opponent. It may be cultural. So we have to be thinking about ourselves, whether we're the right interlocutors, and sometimes we're not. I mean, I've been asked to mediate in situations which culturally are so utterly removed from my experience that my response is, I'm completely the wrong person to do that. You need to find somebody that's a better cultural fit.
So this is really hard to believe, but we are almost out of time. This has just gone so quickly. So I wanted to encourage us to conclude by inviting both of you to offer any final thoughts or reflections, and in particular to maybe take a moment to think about what you might take away from this conversation or what you might want our audience to take away from this conversation.
I am, so interested in the details of how Laurie does this work that I really would love to just follow him around, right? I mean, this is just wonderful. I'm just drinking it up. I think that, one of the things that I think an audience might really take away is how much knowledge there is in this set of professionals, right? Like you, Laurie, and that we do have, as a society, we have these professionals who really, I'm thinking about, for instance, the impeachment that just went down and the kind of like incredible conflict that we're in as a nation right now. And that we don't know how to move forward. And I'm not saying that harmony is the goal, but that we have a conflict that we don't know how to address. And I guess the thing that I would like people to take away is, to some degree, a sense of hopefulness, that there are people who actually have real knowledge and expertise in a real practical living way in managing these kinds of conflicts. And I would kind of make a plea, like, please seek some of this wisdom, because I think I'm really trying to think through, when is the right time? I just have a lot of questions. When is the right time to bring in a kind of mediator or somebody with this expertise, versus when do we want to go and have a fight, right? And how can we use this expertise to have the right kinds of fights? So I'll stop there.
Great. Okay, thank you. That sets me up very nicely, because I want to take the mediator off the pedestal that you put her on. So I would like people to take away from this conversation the idea that mediation can be extremely helpful. Parties get stuck. We get stuck in our relationships with loved ones, in our families, with our work colleagues, in communities, short of the big civil war, insurrection type situations. We get stuck. And mediators can be very helpful. If you think about your own family and workplace, there are some individuals that hate conflict and run away from it. There are others that, for whatever reason, seem to enjoy it pathologically, well, they're combative. And there are others that naturally play a peacemaker role. That's true of all our institutions. It's true of all communities. And these are not super high trained mediators. They're people who have a temperament and a passion, a vocation for peacemaking. It's the instinct to make peace. So I think that like 80% of good mediation is temperament and judgment, and only 20% is skill and technique. And there's no mystery to the skill and technique. You can learn it quite easily. You learn from your own experience, of course, and you learn from making mistakes and watching others that are good. But all of us have the capacity, if we have the temperament, to be mediators. So I think we need to get mediation off the pedestal, that we can all practice mediation. We can all learn to be better mediators. We need to be, as another take home from the conversation, we need to be comfortable with uncomfortable things. As a mediator or facilitator at Notre Dame, for example, the mediation program is very interested in questions of racial justice. And we're interested in the idea of managing a difficult conversation. I've done workshops with colleagues in Kia, and we open these workshops by saying, there is nothing we cannot talk about. We need to talk respectfully, we need to talk compassionately, we need to listen to each other, but there's nothing that should be taboo. Because we're talking to each other. This is not violence. We should be able to say anything in our hearts and in our heads. But lastly, and to address Kate's question, when is it right for mediation and when is it not? Because if you look at what's gone on in the US over the last week, never mind the broader context, with the storming of the Capitol, is this a mediation problem or problem to be addressed through mediation? Or is this a law enforcement problem? Now, my short answer would be it can be both. I mean, I mediate in situations where the police are involved, and I say to the police, you get on with it. I'm not interfering in law enforcement, and don't interfere in my mediation. So you can have multiple strategies for addressing a conflict, but my final response as the mediator is, what do the parties themselves want? If all the parties in any conflict want to resolve their conflict through mediation, I'm available. Mediators are available. If they don't, for whatever reason, a sound reason or a non-sound reason, well, then there's no mediation that's possible.
Wonderful. Thank you both for joining us today and for this conversation. I have learned a lot, and I have a lot of food for thought. One thing that initially brought Katherine and I together is a shared interest as anthropologists in mediation processes at different scales. And I feel like I'm seeing my own field work anew as a result of this conversation. So thanks to you both. We would also like to thank everybody at the Kroc Institute for their support, in particular the director of Kroc, Asher Kaufman, communications director, Hannah Heinziker, and events manager, Lisa Gallagher, who's helping us put together this recording today. We invite you to watch our other dialogues in February and March, and to join us for this series Capstone Live event to be held on April 7th at 4 p.m. with Professor Kamari Maxine Clark, who is professor of anthropology at UCLA and the author most recently of a really incredible book, Affective Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the Pan-Africanist Pushback. So we hope that you can join us for some of these other events. Thank you so much, and thank you to Laurie and to Katherine.